I only needed shelter. Then one maple billet sounded like it was hiding something.
No room, no wages, no winter coat worth naming. Just a canvas tool roll and $5 she had saved from sharpening chisels after hours. And with that $5, she bought a forgotten bowling pin turner's shed outside Milwaukee in Waukesha County, Wisconsin, where it had fallen off county maps in 1978. The north wall leaned 6 inches. The lathe chain lay snapped beneath its bed. The county condemned the shed on October 14, 2021, with demolition planned for spring. Inside one unturned maple billet, a glued wooden plug had sealed a hollow chamber for more than 40 years, holding money and a message meant for someone not yet known. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Clara Voss had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child in West Allis, she counted stair risers, window muntins, and seconds between thunder and rain. Other children drew houses. Clara drew the joints beneath the roofline. At 9, she dismantled a broken kitchen chair and rebuilt it before supper, though one rung remained crooked for years. Her father, Emil, left when she was 6, taking a blue suitcase and the good hammer. Her mother, Ruth, answered hardship by making rooms smaller. Curtains stayed closed to save heat. Meals were portioned before anyone sat down. Wood shavings from Clara's pockets went straight into the trash. The one person who never asked Clara to make herself smaller was her grandfather, Anton Voss, a retired pattern maker with a thumb flattened by 40 years of machinery. Every Saturday, he met her behind his narrow garage on South 68th Street, where a cast-iron lathe stood under a canvas cover and the air carried linseed oil, coffee, and maple dust. Anton taught her to read grain before touching a blade. He showed her how hard maple could look calm on the surface while holding tension deep inside, and how a careless cut would release that tension all at once. They sharpened gouges on a slow wheel, checked bevels against a lamp, and turned scrap into handles, knobs, and once a small bowling pin no taller than Clara's palm. At noon, they ate rye bread with mustard beside the warm motor housing, while he told her about Milwaukee factories that had once turned pins by the thousands. Wood remembers every blow, but it also remembers the hand that steadied it, Anton said. Clara understood only the first half then. Years later, the second half would become the part she kept. He died in February of her 17th year, after 3 quiet weeks in a hospital near Lake Michigan. By the time Clara reached the garage, Ruth had already sold the lathe, the chisels, the sharpening stones, and Anton's ledgers to a dealer from Racine. The little maple pin was gone as well. Only a crescent of pale sawdust remained beneath the bench, protected from the broom by one rusted coffee can. Clara found work at Halpern Architectural Millwork, where stair rails and church panels moved through the building under fluorescent light. The director, Martin Krell, wore polished shoes that never gathered dust and kept his office door open just wide enough to hear machines slow. He corrected workers with a pencil tap against his clipboard. Overtime vanished from timesheets. Lumber invoices grew while orders shrank. When anyone asked about missing pay, Krell looked past them toward the production floor and said the company was surviving because he alone understood sacrifice. On November 19th, after the bank froze Halpern's accounts, Krell announced bankruptcy from the loading dock and drove away before noon. Clara's final month of wages never came. That evening, the boarding house owner placed Clara's canvas suitcase beside the radiator, where melting frost darkened the leather corners. Ruth stood near the stairs in her brown wool coat. She had been listed as Clara's emergency guarantor and had received the owner's call before Clara did. The woman pointed at the suitcase and said, "Take your suitcase and leave before midnight, Clara." 8 words, spoken without heat. Clara looked toward her mother. Ruth tightened one glove at the wrist, then turned her face toward the window. She did not offer a bed, a dollar, or the spare key Clara knew still hung behind the flour tin. For 6 weeks, Clara moved through Milwaukee's cold seams. She slept 2 nights in the Amtrak station, 4 beneath the Central Library awning, and nearly a week in a church boiler vestibule on North Van Buren Street. When wind came off the lake, she rode the Green Line bus to the end and back, buying one fare and staying awake. Her money became $4.20 after coffee, $3.10 after a day-old roll, then $1.87 after laundromat heat and aspirin. She washed in public restrooms, dried socks beneath hand blowers, and kept Anton's tool roll with its 2 chisels, folding rule, and stiff brass caliper. On the 41st day, snow began before noon. Clara entered the Milwaukee Public Library to warm her hands and found the local property notices folded beside a radiator. Most advertised tax sales far beyond anything she could pay. One line, boxed in pencil, read, "Abandoned Turner's Shed, $5, buyer assumes liens and removal order." The parcel number led to a county file showing a strip near an industrial spur west of the city. Someone had written "No utilities" across the photograph. She read the notice 3 times, then she placed her last $5 bill flat beneath the brass caliper and smoothed its corners with her thumb. A bus could take her part way. The rest would be walking. By closing time, she had copied the clerk's address, the parcel number, and every warning printed beneath it. At dawn, Clara tied Anton's tool roll beneath her coat and boarded the westbound bus before the snowplows reached the curb. The bus left Clara beside a shuttered filling station 12 miles east of the county seat, its exhaust briefly warming the air before dissolving into snow. She walked until dusk along County Road D, carrying the suitcase in one hand and Anton's tool roll beneath her coat. The temperature fell to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. When her fingers stopped closing properly, she climbed through a broken rail fence and slept in a hay barn behind a red silo, buried to her shoulders in dry timothy. Mice worked somewhere inside the wall. Before sunrise, the farmer entered with a lantern, saw the shape she made beneath the hay, and silently left a jar of water and 2 boiled eggs on an overturned bucket. By mid-morning, she reached Brookfield Junction, a narrow settlement the newer highway had passed without taking along. Harlan's Hardware occupied an old brick feed store beside Doris Bell's Cafe. Across the road stood Kessler Pharmacy, a barber shop called the White Chair, and St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, its copper cross dark against the winter sky. A 6th storefront had papered windows and a faded sign reading, "Voss Turned Woodworks." Clara stopped beneath that sign only long enough to read it twice. Then she followed the courthouse arrows painted on a snowbank. The county clerk's office occupied the rear of a limestone municipal building where melted salt had dried white across the floor. Behind the counter sat a woman with silver hair gathered in a net and a strip of blue carbon paper staining the side of her forefinger. Her brass nameplate read Mrs. Eleanor Ward, Deputy Clerk. Clara placed the property notice on the counter. Mrs. Ward looked at the suitcase, then at Clara's shoes, whose cardboard insoles had begun to show through the leather. "You understand there is no electrical service." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the well has not been tested." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county can order demolition if the structure is unsafe." "Yes, ma'am." "And you understand that $5 buys the liability with the land?" "Yes, ma'am." The clerk did not touch the notice for several seconds. Then she opened a gray parcel book and turned it sideways so Clara could see the inked boundary. 1.8 acres between an abandoned rail spur and a marsh-fed creek. The shed itself was marked by a rectangle no larger than a thumbnail. "You have the $5? Clara removed the bill she had flattened in the library. Mrs. Ward held it up toward the window, perhaps from habit, perhaps because she had never processed a deed for so little. She placed it in the cash drawer, typed Clara's name onto 3 forms, and pressed a round brass stamp into the final sheet. The mechanism struck with the weight of a small hammer. "There, recorded at 11:42. Clara signed beneath the stamp. Mrs. Ward reached for the deed, but paused when she saw the surname. "Voss," she said. "Any relation to Anton Voss?" Clara's hand remained on the pen. "He was my grandfather." The blue-stained finger rested against the paper. "My father worked with him at Schaefer Pin and Lane. Anton set the turning knives after the night shift ruined 100 billets. He could hear a bad glue line before the wood touched the lathe." Clara looked toward the papered storefront across the road. That shop carried his name for 3 years. He rented the front room from the man who owned your shed. Mrs. Ward lowered her voice, though no one else was present. Anton left after the factory changed hands. He came back once every spring to inspect the roof. Then, one year, he stopped. He never told me. Men from those shops kept many things quiet. Injuries, debts, kindness. The clerk slid the deed across the counter. The original turner was Silas Bell. His daughter ran the accounts. Anton learned from both of them. Clara folded the deed along its printed margins. Mrs. Ward wrote directions on the back of an envelope. Take Pilgrim Road north for 1 mile, then west on Watertown Plank. Pass the old quarry gate. The lane begins after the second culvert, opposite a white mailbox with no number. If you reach the rail bridge, you have gone too far. Outside, the snow had thinned to hard grains. Clara followed Pilgrim Road past low warehouses, then turned where the clerk had marked. A man repairing fence wire raised one mitten as she passed. His dog, a black and white collie with one folded ear, trotted to the road and watched her without barking. Beyond them, 5 walnut trees stood in a line above the creek, their bare crowns holding small islands of snow. The lane had nearly disappeared beneath sumac. Clara pushed through until the shed emerged behind the trees. It was larger than the county photograph suggested, nearly 30 feet long and 18 feet wide, built from cream brick below and weathered pine above. Tar paper showed through missing roof shingles. A square brick chimney leaned slightly east. Over the double doors hung a wooden sign whose remaining letters read, Bell's Standard Pin Works. Rust had spread beneath each iron hinge like dried rain. Clara fitted the county key into the padlock. It turned after 3 attempts. The door opened inward with a sound like a deep wooden cough. Cold air moved past her, carrying old glue, mouse nests, wet brick, and the faint sweetness of maple dust. Her glove brushed the wall and came away gray. Somewhere in the back room, water dripped into metal with a patient, hollow note. The front room held a scarred desk, 2 wall racks, and a row of unfinished pins whose white coating had yellowed toward ivory. When Clara lifted one, its chipped belly felt unexpectedly balanced in her hand. Dust gathered on her tongue. She could taste rust where she had bitten her cracked lip. A narrow doorway led to the workroom. The lathe filled its center, longer than a dining table, with an iron headstock at one end and the broken drive chain curled beneath it. Leather belts hung stiff from overhead pulleys. Maple billets lay against the far wall, some split along their glue seams, others still wrapped in brown paper darkened by damp. She found the well pump outside beneath a wooden cover, but the handle would not move. The outhouse door had fallen from one hinge. There was no bed, no stove she trusted, and no light except what entered through the cracked western panes. Clara returned before darkness settled. She swept one rectangle of floor with a broken push broom, laid flattened pin cartons beneath her coat, and placed Anton's tool roll under her head. The building tightened as the temperature fell, boards clicked, the chimney released one small stone into the dead firebox. Through the roof a gap showed 3 stars. Clara held the deed against her chest until the paper warmed. $5 had not bought safety, and it had not bought comfort. It had bought a door no one else had chosen to open, knocked down 1,000 times but set it upright, and the game will continue. At first light, Clara carried the dented wash basin outside and began with the well. The pump handle resisted until she removed its pivot pin, brushed rust from the joint with a scrap of burlap, and worked 3 spoonfuls of machine oil into the sleeve. On the 7th stroke, the pipe coughed brown water. By the 20th, it ran clear enough to fill a glass jar, though she boiled every drop. She reset the outhouse door with 2 salvaged screws and a leather hinge cut from an abandoned drive belt. For 3 days she learned the building by sound, the short complaint near the desk, the hollow board beside the lathe, the soft double click beneath the west window. On the 4th morning she walked back to Harlan's Hardware. The store smelled of paraffin, fertilizer, and oiled rope. Metal bins lined the walls beneath handwritten labels. Behind the counter stood a broad man with one eyebrow burned away and a carpenter's pencil tucked into the surviving half. His apron read, Walter Harlan, though everyone entering called him Walt. He watched Clara place 6 corroded screws and a length of broken chain on the counter. You buy the Bell place? Yes. That roof will take your money first. I do not have enough for the roof. Then the chimney will take your life first. Clara unfolded the deed to show she was not asking for charity. Walt read the county stamp, rubbed his jaw, and opened a green account book. "I can carry $10 until February. No more. I cannot promise February. Then promise you'll tell me before you disappear." She nodded. He wrote Clara Voss on the first blank line and pushed an old paperback across the counter. Its cover showed a man repairing a porch with tools too clean to have been used. "Previous edition," Walt said. "The measurements still work." She bought a chimney brush for $2.40, 30 feet of quarter-inch rope for 85 cents, a pound of sixpenny nails for 62 cents, stove cement for $1.15, lamp oil for 70 cents, and a used crosscut saw for $3. Walt added a box of kitchen matches without entering it in the book. The chimney took most of that day and half the next. Clara first covered the firebox opening with an old flour sack, leaving one corner loose to release air. On the roof, she tied the round wire brush to the rope and lowered it until it struck the bend above the smoke chamber. The first pull produced almost nothing. She turned the brush clockwise, lifted it 6 inches, and dropped it again. A black fall answered inside the flue. For 4 hours, she repeated the motion, climbing down twice to empty creosote from the firebox. Some came loose as dry flakes, but the lower section held a glazed layer that reflected lamplight like dark glass. She broke it carefully with a narrow scraper taped to a broom handle, never striking hard enough to loosen the mortar. By evening, 2 buckets of soot stood behind the shed, and her arms trembled when she raised them. The next morning, she held a mirror inside the firebox while sunlight entered from above. A pale circle appeared in the glass. She sealed 3 visible cracks with stove cement, waited 6 hours, and built a test fire no larger than her 2 hands. Paper drew upward at once, then came kindling, followed by one split length of maple. Smoke lifted through the chimney without entering the room. Clara heated water in a tin coffee pot and cooked oats with half an apple Walt had placed inside the manual. She ate, sitting on the lathe bed, holding the bowl close enough for steam to warm her face. The fire clicked softly behind her. For the first time since leaving the boarding house, she removed her coat indoors. That afternoon, she began the workroom inventory. She found 3 long turning gouges with mushroomed handles, a brass outside caliper, a steel pin gauge stamped 2LB12OZ, and a rack of curved profile templates shaped to the belly and neck of a regulation pin. Beneath the bench lay a canvas bag of fiber base discs, each one drilled through the center. A dipping hook hung above an empty enameled tank where finished pins had once received their white coating. On the wall, nearly hidden by dust, someone had penciled lathe speeds beside different billet diameters. The objects had not been abandoned carelessly. They had been placed as though the worker expected to return after supper. Clara tested every floorboard before moving the heavier billets. Near the west wall, one maple block gave a dull answer when she tapped it with the brass caliper. The billet was nearly 4 feet long and thick enough to become the shop's master demonstration pin. Its outer surface was gray with age, but the end grain remained tight. She tapped again. Solid maple answered with a clean, high knock. This sound sat lower. Clara rolled the billet 6 inches and stopped. It moved too easily. A block of that size should have required both arms and the leverage of a bar. She fetched the steel pin gauge, then made a crude balance using a plank across a length of iron pipe. On one end, she placed the billet. On the other, she stacked 3 known blocks of similar maple. The large billet rose first. She examined both ends under the western window. One growth ring near the wider end seemed interrupted. It was not a ring at all, but the edge of a circular plug cut from matching wood. Fine sawdust had been pressed into the seam before glue was applied. Whoever made it had expected inspection. Clara warmed the joint with a cloth soaked in hot water, then used the narrowest chisel from Anton's roll. She worked around the circle 1 fraction at a time. The glue softened unevenly. Twice the chisel slipped, and twice she stopped to sharpen it on the small stone Walt had wrapped inside the manual. After 40 minutes, the disc lifted. The hollow inside smelled of old paper and cedar oil. Clara reached in only after measuring the depth with her folding rule. 12 inches below the opening, her fingers met a second disc, this one made from aromatic cedar. It had been cut to fit without glue. She hooked its center hole with the dipping hook and drew it out slowly. Beyond it lay 4 packages wrapped in waxed cloth. The first held Anton's turning tools. Clara knew them before she saw the initials burned into their ash handles, the shallow gouge with the dark crescent near its ferrule, the skew chisel ground slightly heavier on the left edge, the small brass calipers he had once adjusted to fit her 9-year-old hand. Ruth had sold them, yet somehow they had returned to a place Anton had never mentioned. The second package contained narrow maple samples, each labeled with a date, moisture percentage, soaking temperature, and glue ratio. A stitched notebook lay beneath them. Its first pages described how to laminate hard maple strips so impact traveled through the pin instead of opening the seams. Later entries recorded resin baths, kiln times, and rejected formulas in cramped blue ink. The third bundle held the little horn bowling pin Clara remembered from Anton's garage. Around its belly, carved so finely that dust had filled the letters, were the words, "Knock down 1,000 times, but set it up right, and the game will continue." She set it beside her knee. The last package was a tin cash box wrapped twice in oilcloth. Its lock had already been removed. Clara lifted the lid and found banknotes divided by paper bands, envelopes of coins, and a velvet pouch gone brown at the drawstring. She did not count quickly. She arranged the bills by denomination on the swept floor, flattening every folded corner beneath the brass caliper. Hundreds first, then 50s, 20s, 10s, and 5s. The coins were older. Morgan silver dollars, Walking Liberty half-dollars, Mercury dimes, and wheat cents wrapped in paper tubes. Several bore dark fingerprints that no polishing had erased. The total came to $25,800 exactly. She counted it again. Inside the velvet pouch lay a tarnished purple heart engraved with the name Daniel Bell and the year 1944. The ribbon had faded almost gray. Beneath it rested one sealed envelope addressed only to the next Turner. Clara placed the money back in the tin box. She wrapped the metal separately in clean cloth. The notebook and horn pin remained on the bench, but she did not open the envelope. By then, the room had darkened beyond useful work. She carried the letter through the rear door and walked to the creek. Thin ice held along the banks while black water moved beneath the center, carrying small leaves past without keeping them. Clara stood there until her fingers stiffened around the envelope. The shed behind her gave off one narrow band of chimney smoke, straight at first, then bending east above the walnut trees. That night, she slept with the unopened letter beneath Anton's tool roll in the tin box against the wall. Knocked down 1,000 times, but set it upright and the game will continue. Morning entered through the west windows as a pale strip across the lathe bed. Clara placed the sealed envelope beside the horn pin and recognized the handwriting before she broke the wax. The narrow capitals, the low crossbar on each T, the deliberate space after every comma. It was Anton's hand from the labels he had tied to sharpening stones and jars of screws. The paper opened along 3 old creases. My dear one, whoever you are. Or if you have found this letter, then you have already listened more carefully than most people ever did. The maple billet was made to sound wrong. Anton Voss helped me hollow it in the spring of 1988, after Dr. Helen Markham at St. Luke's Hospital in Milwaukee told me the cancer had reached my liver and that another winter was unlikely. My name is Margaret Bell. Silas Bell, my great-grandfather, came from Bangor, Maine in 1871 and began turning wagon hubs beside this creek. His son, Nathaniel, changed the shop to bowling pins in 1902, when Milwaukee alleys began ordering faster than local turners could supply them. Nathaniel's daughter, Rose Bell, born here in 1878, kept the books, mixed the glues, and corrected every man who claimed women did not understand grain. Rose's daughter, Evelyn, married Daniel Bell in 1921. I was their only child, born in this shed's front room during the blizzard of 1926. 4 generations worked here before me, though only 3 names appeared on the sign. The trade closed on September 30th, 1956. Molded plastic coatings, larger factories, and contracts written far from the men who handled the wood ended it more surely than any broken machine. Daniel, my older brother, was killed near St. Lo, France, during the Normandy campaign in July 1944. The Purple Heart belongs to him. My father kept his place at supper for 11 years. After the doors closed, this building remained silent for more than 30 years. Anton came each spring to oil the lathe and check the roof. He had learned from my mother, Evelyn, and he believed the work deserved one more careful pair of hands. The notebook contains what we knew. Hard maple must reach 6 to 8% moisture before lamination. Warm the resin to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, but never above 85. Use 1 part hardener to 4 parts adhesive by weight, and clamp the strips for no less than 9 hours. After turning, let the finished body rest 48 hours before the first sealing coat. A pin that is hurried may look sound and still open at the first true strike. The money came from selling the last inventory, the rear parcel by the railway, and my mother's savings. It is not payment for blood, name, or family. Work does not pass through blood alone. It passes through attention. It belongs to the person willing to sharpen the dull edge, measure twice when no one is watching, and begin again after a spoiled piece has been carried to the stove. Use the money slowly. Repair what keeps out weather. Make the chimney safe. Buy only what allows the next honest task. Keep Daniel's medal until you can place it where his name will not be forgotten. Behind the shed, beyond the walnut trees, you will find a low stone marker beside the creek. Light the small brass inspection lamp there once, if the wick remains. It belonged to Rose. She used it to judge glue seams before dawn. Anton wanted to leave his tools to a grandchild who understood them. He did not know whether he would be allowed to. When he gave them to me, he said that loss should not have the final word merely because it spoke first. I hope you have arrived before the roof fails. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Margaret Evelyn, Bell, October 3rd, 1988. Clara read the letter twice. The second time, she slowed at Anton's name and placed one fingertip beneath each line as if keeping the words from moving. Then she folded the pages along Margaret's original creases, returned them to the envelope, and set the envelope beneath the horn pin. Outside, the thaw had softened the crust of snow along the creek. Clara passed the 5 walnut trees and found the marker almost hidden beneath blackberry canes. It was a low block of limestone, darkened by lichen, with a shallow turning mark carved into its face, 2 opposing curves meeting at a narrow neck. Behind it stood an iron hook driven into the earth. She cleared the vines with Anton's skew chisel. Beneath the marker lay a brass inspection lamp wrapped in the remains of a flour sack. Its reservoir still held a trace of oil thick as varnish. Clara cleaned the burner with a strand of copper wire, replaced the ruined wick with cotton pulled from the hem of a pin carton, and filled it from the bottle she had bought at Harlan's. The flame rose no higher than her thumbnail. She hung the lamp from the iron hook. Its light touched the carved mark, the creek ice, and the bark of the nearest walnut. Clara stood beside it until the brass grew warm enough to release the faint smell of old oil. On the walk back, she considered the farmer who had left water and eggs without asking her name. Mrs. Ward had kept the office open while Clara signed each page slowly. Walt Harlan had entered $10 of credit under a name he had no reason to trust. The bus driver had waited while she dragged her suitcase through the snow, though she had not asked him to. Perhaps you remember a small kindness that arrived when you had no way to repay it. A meal left quietly, a door held open, a few patient minutes when the world had become hurried. What was it, and whose hand placed it within your reach? Clara returned to the workroom before the lamp burned out. She wrapped Daniel's medal in Margaret's letter, laid Anton's tools beside the mattress of flattened cartons, and placed the horn pin between them. That night, the objects did not feel like valuables. They felt like witnesses. The first lasting snow came on December 3rd, 6 inches laid evenly across the shed before dawn. Clara woke when meltwater struck the wash basin beside her head. She opened Walt's repair manual to the roofing chapter and read it 3 times, once beside the stove, once beneath the failing rafters, and once outside where the roof line could correct the drawings. The shed measured 30 feet by 18. Allowing for pitch, overlap, and waste, she calculated 16 rolls of felt, 22 bundles of asphalt shingles, and 30 pounds of galvanized roofing nails. The materials would consume more than she wished to touch from Margaret's cash, but the letter had named weather first. Walt delivered the order in his truck. Before leaving, he placed a roofing hatchet on the tailgate. Its handle had been wrapped with a black electrician's tape. "My brother Len used this," he said. "He won't be needing it." A former roofer named Amos Pike appeared the next morning carrying a thermos and a carpenter's square. He was 71 with one stiff knee and a white mustache that gathered frost when he spoke. Clara offered wages. "No," Amos said, "you keep the coffee hot." The east slope had one rafter split nearly 4 feet along its grain. They lifted a new board beside it, clamped the two together, and drove carriage bolts through both. The old rafter kept in place, the sister rafter taking its burden. Clara snapped chalk lines across the felt while Amos showed her how to set each nail with 3 strokes. One to place it, one to drive, one to seat the head flat. That nail's proud, pull it. Another afternoon, Clara watched his hatchet hover over a crooked shingle, too much overhang, half an inch. Cut it back. They worked 11 days, losing 2 to sleet and 1 to wind strong enough to lift the felt from Clara's hands. By December 16th, the final ridge cap lay straight beneath the chimney. That night, rain replaced snow. Clara sat on the floor listening for the wash basin's metal note. It never came. January exposed what firelight had hidden. Several chimney bricks were spalling, their outer faces peeling away in thin red shells, and the mortar between them had softened into powder. Clara could press a nail into some joints with her thumb. Amos would not climb in winter, but he drew the repair on the back of a shingle wrapper. Walt supplied hydraulic lime and fire clay. Clara mixed 3 parts lime mortar to 1 part fire clay for the joints nearest the flue, adding water slowly until the mixture held a ridge without cracking. For 3 weeks, she worked in temperatures that rarely rose above the 20s. She removed loose mortar with a narrow plugging chisel, brushed each joint clean, misted the brick, and packed the new mixture deep with a pointing trowel. Every 15 minutes, her bare hands went numb. Gloves protected her skin but ruined her feel for the mortar, so she warmed her fingers against a cloth-covered kettle and began again. The upper courses required a plank platform tied through the rafters. One morning, the mortar froze before setting, and she scraped out 4 feet of work rather than leave a weak joint beneath the cap. On January 28th, she built a test fire from newspaper, pine kindling, and 1 maple split. Clara held a smoking twist of paper near the firebox opening. The flame leaned inward, smoke climbed without wavering, and no dark thread escaped through the repaired brick. She fed the fire 1 more piece and watched the chimney draw clean. The floorboards were white pine, fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails whose irregular tops caught the light after Clara scrubbed away the soot. Several planks had cupped, but only 2 were rotten enough to replace. She lifted them intact, copied their widths, and cut salvaged boards from a dry partition in the rear storeroom. Walt rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. Clara planned every movement before plugging it into the borrowed generator. The first pass used 80 grit paper to remove blackened oil and raised grain. The second, at 120, erased the circular scratches. The final pass, at 220, left the boards smooth without making them look new. Dust found every opening. It coated her eyelashes, settled inside the stove lid, and turned the water in her washcloth gray. She set the rosehead nails below the surface with a punch, then filled only the deepest scars. The smaller marks remained. She applied 3 thin coats of tung oil mixture, wiping away every pool after 20 minutes and allowing a full 48-hour cure after the last coat. Under the oil, the pine shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, its long grain emerging beneath decades of grime. One morning, Clara woke unable to lift the sanding block. She dressed, walked to the marsh, and sat on a fallen cottonwood without opening the manual. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, one leg hidden, its body so still that creek water seemed to move around a carved figure. When it finally opened its wings, Clara watched until it crossed the railway embankment. She did no work that day. The following morning, she returned to the floor and polished the final room by hand. 8 windows remained in the shed. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The 8th held a single original pane made in 1788, salvaged by the Bell family from an earlier farmhouse and set into the west sash. Its surface flowed in small waves, bending the walnut branches beyond it. Clara removed that sash herself and stored it flat between two blankets while the others were repaired. She cut replacement glass 1/8 inch smaller than each opening. After bedding the panes in a thin layer of Diap 33 glazing putty, she pressed glazing points into the muntins with the side of a putty knife, careful never to drive pressure towards the glass. A final putty bevel shed water toward the outside edge. The sash cords had failed in 5 windows. Clara used 1/4-inch cotton cord, lowering each counterweight into its pocket and securing the line with a figure-8 knot large enough to hold but compact enough to move freely. The first sash dropped hard because she had crossed the cords. She opened the pocket, corrected the run, and tested it 20 times. For the preserved west pane, she cleaned only with warm water and a soft cloth. No scraper touched the old glass. When it returned to its frame, the wavering surface made the afternoon appear to breathe. On February 26th, Clara set the final repaired sash into the north wall. She raised it 3 inches, released her hand, and watched it remain exactly where she left it. Outside, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch, close enough that she could see the small black cap turned toward the new glass. It tapped the bark once, shook loose a thread of snow, and flew toward the creek. Behind the stove, the wall still carried horsehair plaster over hand-split oak lath, each narrow strip roughened by an adze. Clara's first patch sagged before noon. The second cracked beside the chimney. The third dried smooth on the surface but loosened when she pressed it with 2 fingers. She removed all 3. Walt brought an old feed bag containing horsehair saved from his father's harness shop. Clara washed it, cut it into thumb-length fibers, and folded it through lime plaster until each handful held together without becoming ropey. The scratch coat went on first, pressed between the laths, and scored with the edge of her trowel. Over it she spread a 3/8 inch brown coat, leveled but not polished, then left it untouched for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The final coat measured barely 1/8 inch. When the surface began to firm, Clara worked it with a wooden float until the new plaster met the old without a ridge. The repairs were not invisible. In evening light, their edges showed like pale islands around the chimney. These patches will hold another 100 years. She rinsed the trowel before the lime could harden. Doris Bell began leaving paper bags on the doorstep every Thursday. She was a compact woman with flour on one sleeve and a red pencil holding her hair in place. The first bag contained bean soup, 2 biscuits, and a square of apple cake wrapped in wax paper. Clara carried money to the cafe. Doris pushed the coins back across the counter with 1 knuckle. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." The following Saturday, a teenage boy arrived on a blue Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. Caleb Harlan had his father's missing eyebrow and none of his caution. He split the storm-fallen maple behind the shed into stove lengths, setting each round on the same scarred stump and striking until the halves opened cleanly. Clara offered him $2. He shook his head and looked toward the workshop door. "My mother said, about your grandfather. That was all." He stacked the wood beneath the eaves, wiped the maul head with an oily rag, and rode home before dark. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his way to St. Matthew's. He was tall enough that his black overcoat ended above his boots, and he carried a silver-topped cane he rarely placed on the ground. He never entered. He tipped his hat toward the chimney smoke, paused beside the lane, and offered the same 4-word prayer. Keep her work honest. Then he continued toward town. By March, Clara had learned that help did not always ask permission before becoming part of a place. Clara postponed the cellar until February 11th, when the thaw softened the earth around its exterior doors enough to move them. 7 granite steps descended beneath the workroom. The third rocked under her weight. Below lay a 12 by 15-foot floor of fieldstone, dry except near the north wall. At its center rested a dressed granite slab, level with the surrounding stones. The same craft mark carved near the creek appeared on its face, a broad bowling pin belly narrowing into a clean neck. Clara swept around it but did not lift it. Under the loose third step her fingers touched oak. She worked free a small box darkened by soil and swollen at one corner. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped like a miniature bowling pin, along with a tintype wrapped in linen. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the shed in the summer of 1903. She wore a long work apron over a pale dress and held a turning gouge upright against her shoulder. Her mouth was Clara's mouth. The set of her eyes was so familiar that Clara lowered the tintype, then raised it again. On the back, written in faded brown ink, were the words Rose Bell, daughter of Nathaniel Bell, age 25, summer of 1903. Clara carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside the horn pin. She tried it in the desk, the tin cash box, the tool cabinet, and both exterior doors. It opened nothing. The granite slab remained where it was. So did the question. The snow retreated first from the south wall, then from the lane. The creak grew loud enough to be heard through closed windows, and the walnut branches loosened pale green catkins over the water. Clara cleaned Anton's tools, but did not begin making full bowling pins that spring. The notebook demanded exact wood, exact moisture, and a patience she had not yet earned. She chose $1 silver from the cash, sold it to a coin dealer in Milwaukee, and spent the money on maple offcuts, adhesive, and 2 new sharpening stones. Her first laminations opened at the seam. The second batch warped. The third held beneath the mallet but split after a night beside the stove. Clara marked each failure with date, temperature, and ratio, then placed it on a shelf rather than burning it. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Clara mounted her first full billet on the restored lathe. The old motor had been rewound in Waukesha. Caleb had replaced the chain and aligned the pulleys under Anton's penciled speeds. Clara checked the billet with the outside calipers, set the tool rest 1/8 inch from the wood, and turned the spindle by hand before closing the switch. The maple began as a blur, then slowly accepted its shape. Clara cut the neck first, leaving extra width for correction. She formed the belly against Rosebell's profile template, stopped the lathe often, and tested the curve with both palms. After sanding, the pin rested 48 hours before sealing. It was not perfectly symmetrical. One shoulder carried a shallow tool mark. She left it there. The restored interior had become spare and useful. The pine floors held the dark glow of old honey. White plaster reflected winter light toward the lathe. Anton's tools hung in order above the bench, and Margaret's notebook remained wrapped in cloth except when Clara needed a measurement. The 1788 pane still bent the walnut trees into wavering columns. The brass key waited on the mantel until the 2nd January. During a hard freeze, Clara noticed an iron plate in the oldest walnut tree, nearly hidden beneath a ridge of bark. The plate had been set chest-high decades earlier, and its keyway was clogged with lichen. She cleaned it with lamp oil and a bone-handled pick. The bowling pin key entered without resistance. A narrow section of the trunk opened inward. The cavity had been lined with tin, leaving the living wood untouched around it. Inside rested a folded 48-star American flag and a sealed note tied with blue thread. The note was dated November 11, 1918. Rose Bell wrote that Nathaniel had placed the compartment in the walnut after America entered the Great War. Her husband Thomas had served with the 32nd Division in France. The flag had hung in the front window until word came that he had died from wounds received near the Meuse-Argonne. Rose folded it alone on Armistice Day while factory whistles sounded across Milwaukee. She asked that the flag remain near the shop until someone could carry the family's dead into remembrance without turning grief into display. Clara refolded the note along its original line. On May 27, 2025, the anniversary week observed at Wood National Cemetery, she brought Daniel Bell's Purple Heart and Rose's flag to the cemetery office in Milwaukee. A records clerk confirmed Daniel's service and located his memorial entry among the wartime dead. There was no ceremony. Clara placed a small maple pin beside the register while the clerk copied the medal's inscription. She stood beneath an oak until the noon bell sounded, then carried the medal home in its cloth. By then, she had used only 4 coins from Margaret's cash. One had purchased practice maple. A second paid for the motor winding. 2 more covered chimney brick, and the copper flashing Amos insisted would outlast them all. The remaining money stayed in the tin box. Clara lined the maple chamber with fresh waxed cloth, returned the banknotes and coins, and added copies of every repair receipt. She placed Margaret's letter on top, along with her own ledger of failed glue ratios, moisture readings, and lathe settings. On the lid she wrote, for the next one. The shop reopened without announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard. Hand-turned maple pins repairs, small orders, ask for Clara. The first order came from a church league that needed one ceremonial pin. Then a retired alley owner requested 6 replacements for a 1950s display. Clara refused large quantities. She worked slowly and required customers to accept the natural grain beneath the coating. By autumn, the mailing list held 43 names. Caleb returned one Saturday carrying a hand-carved sign wrapped in a wool blanket. He had grown taller and now worked 3 days a week in Harlan's while studying machinery at the technical college. The sign read, Bell and Voss Standard Pin. Works and Daughters. Clara ran her thumb across the final line. There are no daughters, she said. Not yet, Caleb answered. He did not mean children. He meant Rose, Evelyn, Margaret, Clara, and whoever might someday stand at the lathe with enough care to hear a hollow billet. They hung the sign beneath the old iron brackets. Caleb climbed down, adjusted it twice, and left without accepting payment. From the road, the new lettering looked settled rather than new. That winter, Clara began her own letter. My dear one, whoever you are, she wrote about the roof first because weather remained the first obligation. She described Walt's account book, Amos's 3-stroke nail technique, Doris's paper bags, Caleb's maul, and Reverend Boyd's forward prayer. She included no claim that the work had saved her. The work had simply given each day a shape and required her presence inside it. She warned the next turner that maple could deceive the eye, that glue temperature mattered, and that a lathe should always be rotated by hand before power reached the spindle. She wrote that inheritance was not ownership. It was maintenance performed for someone whose name had not yet appeared. Near the bottom of the page, she copied the words carved into the horn pin. Knocked down 1,000 times, but set it upright, and the game will continue. Then she added her signature and left the date blank. In the evenings, the lathe cooled with small iron clicks while creek water moved beneath the walnut roots. The brass lamp still burned beside the stone marker once each year, its flame no taller than Clara's thumbnail. The wooden bowling pin turner's shed waits. It has always waited. At the county office, Mrs. Ward retired the following spring. While clearing her desk, she found Clara's $5 bill pressed flat beneath the drawer liner, where she had placed it instead of sending it to the treasury. She left it there for the next clerk, beside the brass stamp and the parcel book.